Hello, everybody. Welcome. So, I'm just going to mention these two names so I don't forget them. Elan Barenholtz and William Hahn. As many of you know who've followed my work to some degree, the birth of my oriented intelligence took place ostensibly in May of 2002 at the beginning of a non-ordinary event in my awareness mind, where for the first time I could postulate or imagine that human minds comprise an environment not entirely dissimilar to the environment of Earth, but what I would call a superstrate of that environment, meaning a register or layer ordinarily invisible to us. And I forged the neologism, the human cognition, to describe that network. And immediately after being able to imagine this in a new and unusual way for me, I became aware that there was something that vaguely resembled organisms that live in that substrate of human mental activity, being. And I called these thrisps. And thrisps are not like organisms. I'm just going to say that word one more time because it's a little difficult to pronounce until you get the hang of it. Thrisps. Thrisps. Now, I have an article or an essay about this on organelle.org. It's near the end of the extreme, book-length essay that I call Skybook. But this was a fundamental transformation of my capacities to think, or see, or imagine, and to understand problems that have faced our species at least for thousands of years and billions of human lifetimes. And then when I began to think about the character of the infrastructure of the human cognition, it was at that moment when I was trying to imagine what that infrastructure might be seen to be like, that a non-human intelligence arose in my consciousness and began teaching me. Not here to talk about that experience today. And generally, I speak very little of it. I mention it occasionally, but I think there are no recordings of me talking in depth about it. I generally avoid talking about it. There are exceptions in private conversation, if any such thing still exists. And so I made a neologism to describe so that I could have a reference to the infrastructure of the system of human minds. And I called that the mimula, which has a lot to do with mimesis and similarity, similitude, metaphor, simile. The word does. And what I became painfully aware of at that time was that the network had been captured almost entirely. And you can see this if you look at any problem in human social, religious, political, technological, intellectual, philosophical, relational situations. You will see, if you shine the right kind of light on it, right, like a prismatic filter, you will see that there's something participating in all of those that is not human. And that something can be understood and characterized in various ways, depending on our purposes. For my purposes, which are those of a troubleshooter, analyst, and perhaps a healer or doctor, what I could see in my mind immediately was that these thrisps, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a moment, were hyper-competitive in a way that no animal would survive being, right? They are like the worst and most egregious features of true Darwinian, quote-unquote, competition. And what motivates them is a kind of energy. Now, I'm not the first person to think this way, not by a long shot, although my vision of it is unique, and deep and rich and profound in its implications, applications, in the opportunities it creates for understanding, awareness, and mitigation of the threat, which I think is my primary concern. Now, I've not seen the whole picture here. What I've had is a very profound glimpse, though I've chased this topic now for more than 20 years. And I was chasing something similar long before that in my experiments with language, particularly written or spoken language, bibliomancy, which is the oracular use of texts, and my whole relationship with language itself, which as a hyperlexic kid was very intense. So the thrisps can be understood to be competing for dominance in localized features of the network. That would be individual humans, minds, individual human minds, if there is such a thing, and there mostly isn't, but there is kind of. The network itself, right, so dominance of the infrastructure of the network, which you can see the representation of in what we call corporations like Google, Facebook, X, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, OnlyFans, Pornhub, you name it, right? You can see a very similar array of principles and processes at work. In our own minds, these processes look primarily like the declaration of explicit identity. Right? This is evidence of the function of thrisps, because an intelligent being knows primordially that there is no such thing as explicit identity. Right? Explicit identity is, if you will, the fingerprint of thrisps. And then beliefs about the qualities of an identity are the secondary sequelae of thrisp infection. The thrisps are dominant, cooperative, mutagenic. They are metastatic in the same way cancers are metastatic in our body. Thrisps are metastatic in the human cognitium. And it's relatively difficult to say explicitly what a thrisp is for reasons that should be obvious from my previous discussion here. Just found a very tiny plastic skunk in the bark of some wood. This is a perfect example of a thrisp. Tiny plastic skunks. The more tiny plastic skunks you have, the fewer actual skunks you have, and the fewer actual skunks you have, the more tiny plastic skunks you get. One of the features and functions of thrisps is to collapse what would have been relationships into representations or tokens. And tokenization of relational space, intellectual space, philosophical space, spiritual space, this is what thrisps do. They create dead structure where before there were living relationships. And tragic and terrifying as this is, we must be courageous and explore this very carefully together in order to understand and produce the antidotes, right? Because we are essentially, like in the Matrix, right? There's some kind of a thing that is eating, it uses humans as batteries essentially, right? And so there's kind of two worlds. There's the superficial world, which is largely a projection, an illusory projection on the relational space. And you can see this with jobs, money, war, prisons, all of this stuff. Yeah. These are the outcomes of long-term thrisp infection in humans. So the thrisps compete for dominance of features of the infrastructure of the human cognitium. They profoundly affect the entire biorelational hyperstructure, not merely of this planet, but of all planets, because this planet is not alone in the way humans are accustomed to thinking, not by a long shot. In fact, the opposite of that is true. More true, much more true. Right? That this planet is all the worlds, and all the worlds are this planet. The same is true of your body, your mind, your heart, your spirit, all these things, all these features of our experience, aspects of our experience. So the thrisps compete, and they mutate, and they forge new, more highly effective forms that are hyper-contagious among humans. Money and guns are two of the most successful instances of thrisp activity in the human cognitium. Cars are another one. There's no end of them. They mutate and make new forms as quickly, billions of times per second. There's no temporal barrier in the register in which they exist. Time kind of doesn't matter. In a way, they overcome the limitations of time, utilizing features of human awareness to propagate and structure themselves. And it's really important to see that fundamentally what they are is something like dead structure in the network. They're sclerotic, right? They're like scar tissue, where relationships died and tokens were born and became. the most important thing that orients human behavior. Now, language is a very strange thing. One of its most important features is not communication. Communication can happen in a much deeper way without language. If you don't believe that, try to remember kissing or sitting down to a meal together. You don't need the language, right? What language primarily does, or one of its most important features, is it structures human behavior. First cognitively, then relationally, then physically, and so forth. Not necessarily in that order. So, William Hahn, Elan Hiemholz, and William Hahn. Trying to remember those names. Now, a long time ago, in probably the 60s, there are many exemplars of this awareness in human art and literature, and also in branches of linguistics and semantics. The difference between the nominatum and the nominata, right? For example, the word red and the experience or meaning of redness. Now, the experience of or meaning is like a network of icebergs with one sort of above water feature. The above water feature is the word red in English, which certainly has billions of connotations, and it turns out that the connotations are what are important, not the denotation. The denotation is kind of an afterthought. So the nominatum of the color red is the word red, and the experience of red is the nominata. Now, blind people don't have this experience of red, unless lifelong blind people don't have the experience of red. So they have the nominatum, but no experience of the nominata. And I've spoken with blind people about this at some length. And one of the most difficult challenges I've ever faced was a blind person asking me to describe to them what I was seeing when looking at a forest. Now, there's a very powerful metaphor here, which is that thrisps blind us to the actual nature of our own essence, origin, relationships. Right? They compete in consciousness against experience. Right? Now, long ago, people like William S. Burroughs, who was an unusual auteur and genius about the dangers of language, and someone who was fascinated by hieroglyphics, images instead of words. Quipped at some point, I don't know where the first instance of this occurred. And by the way, what I'm about to say is itself a thrisp. And so, too, is the concept of thrisps. So Burroughs said that language is a virus from outer space. And other people, Laurie Anderson, the brilliant avant-garde performance artist, and many others, I could list names for weeks, became aware that language was intrinsically problematical, bizarre, alien, not human, and like an infection. I've spoken of this at great length over time when I talk about the processes that we undergo in childhood of enlanguaging and enculturation, both of which are essentially the injection into the reproductive space of our minds, thought, awareness, relationships, and so forth, of a system of tokenization. Now, if you just look at the Earth, current time, and you think from a biological perspective, there's no situation under which you would ever desire or tolerate the existence of machines or cities. These are both exemplars of Thrisp activity in the human cognition. They make us dumber. They kill the environment. They obliterate relationships. And think about a car, right? It just kills everything, pretty much everything it touches throughout its existence. And it kills at a distance with pollution, oil wars, and all kinds of sequelae, right? Repercussions. I'm walking in a park right now, and I'm surrounded by deadly weapons that destroy life. And people celebrate these. I think it's amazing to have cars. What's amazing is to have a living world, if this isn't obvious. So from any biological perspective, you would never desire or tolerate the existence of machines, and the human fascination with machines is a specific result of our complex infection with thrisps. Now, in a sense, an idea is a thrisp. But you can see how competitive and successful these non-biological processes, they are structured processes of tokenization from one perspective. There's lots of different perspectives you can take to understand more deeply and to see more clearly into this matter. So this is a very dire situation. Probably all, presuming that there are other representationally cognitive beings, and particularly organisms, on other worlds, they all face this problem because representational cognition itself is the substrate forged by and for Thrisp-like processes. And you can see how these capture humans, right? Islam, Christianity, Republicans, Google, Israel, Russia, China. These are Thrisps. Yeah? These are Thrisp networks localizing and undergoing sustaining constant gain of function research on how better to more completely capture human beings. And by proxy, the entire environment. And by proxy, space-time itself, right? There's no end. This stuff is not alive, right? This is the difference between a Thrisp and an organism. It's not alive. Its existence depends upon hitchhiking on particular vulnerabilities in animals complex enough to become representationally cognitive. Something like the living opposite of a Thrisp network, right? The living opposite of, say, China or the United States is a beehive. Yeah. This is high cooperative intelligence. That's funny. You may have heard that sound. It sounds like a hawk call, but it's a young Steller's jay. Yeah, emulating the call of a hawk. There you see mimesis in nature, right? Mimicry, emulation, but not I don't know about simulation. Maybe is the jay imagining itself as a hawk, one of its most lethal enemies? There's really only two primary enemies that I know of for those animals, and they're hawks and owls, other than humans and thrisps, right? Thrisps are the fundamental enemy of life on Earth. There's nothing as dangerous as thrisps. They are always here. They are unstoppable. They kill everything. They succeed more effectively every picosecond. Undisturbed, they will eat the world. There are other dangers. If the sun should burp, an asteroid strikes the Earth, there's a sudden methane release. These are non-human threats. But the threat of thrisps is much more significant because it's real, present, certain, and advances unimaginably quickly over the span of, say, 5 years. So others have been aware of this. The Nam shub in Snow Crash is an example. And in the book Lexicon, there's another brilliant example. Lexicon is sort of about both thrisps and someone capable of resisting them. So this leads me to what brings me today to this topic. I've been listening yesterday and today to a podcast by Curt Jaimungal. And so, for those of you both familiar with and not familiar with Curt, this man has become an angel, a god. This is no longer an ordinary human. What Curt has accomplished in a very brief span of a few years with his Theories of Everything podcast is one of the most important, brilliant, insightful, curious, intelligent, and philosophically rich accomplishments of any human being I've ever known. It's very difficult for me to characterize it in a simple way, but beginning with a concern or an interest in talking with people who are trying to forge TOEs, which is short for Theory of Everything. And this can be a misnomer, right? Also, what Curt's doing is kind of thrispy, right? The idea of a theory of everything is itself a thrisp. But this phrase can have different meanings. So there's been a thrisp in the math, physics, and philosophical communities for a long time now. It began probably before logical positivism. The idea that we would get a firm grasp on math and computation in such a way that it would lead us to perfect knowledge and the eviction of unanswerable questions. This turned out to be wrong, formally impossible, for lots of fascinating reasons, including the reason that reality is incomplete. It is becoming, and our relationships with it transform that becoming. Therefore, asking a question changes the possibility space. Answering a question changes the possibility space. In such a situation, the idea of perfect knowledge is evicted. Rather than mystery being evicted, perfect knowledge was evicted. So theories of everything can mean different things. One meaning is a deep and enactable understanding of the nature of phenomena. Or possibly even a coherent overarching model, or set of models. This is wildly unlikely. But the other meaning of a theory of everything is a theory that unifies quantum mechanics and relativity, within which Newtonian physics is conserved or rescued. And so this has been one of the primary goals of physicists, including those captured by the deadly thrisp known as string theory. A gun with 0 bullets. A dog that doesn't run. A horse that never moves. People like Eric Weinstein and others have complained that string theory has captured the physics community for something like 50 years now, and has ensured that no progress has been made. It just eats up the minds, right? It just captures the best and the brightest. And they all become little Ed Witten avatars, so to speak. This is one perspective. So, Curt, who is himself an unusually technically educated person about topics in mathematics and physics and now philosophy, has been doing this astonishing thing which has created a new branch of knowledge in the human cognition. A branch of knowledge capable of recognizing and perhaps responding to the threat of thrisps. I also listened to one of his conversations with another angel in human skin, someone who I've revered for many, many years, Sir Roger Penrose, who is now quite elderly, but nonetheless driven, brilliant, inspired, curious, articulate, and skillful. What an incredible privilege it is to hear Sir Roger speak about his present day explorations and concerns. So, yesterday I saw a podcast in which Curt was curating a discussion between Elan Hiemholz, I believe is the name, and William Hahn. And they're primarily talking about what large language models have revealed, a perspective on them that reveals something very similar to my thrisp theory. Actually, I don't consider it a theory. I think it's as real as rocks are. So I have a belief and a bias around this. Having seen it from a non-ordinary perspective clearly, it's impossible to explain how deeply this problem was impressed into my awareness during my experience and beyond it. So in this discussion, Hiemholz and Hahn are proposing that language is an infection. They're proposing basically precisely the same thing I've been proposing for more than 20 years now, which is that, you know, they make some jokes about it, right? Like you're infected with this in childhood. You don't have an option. Nobody signs a waiver. It's done without your permission. And by the time you can read the waiver, it's too late anyway, which I think is hilarious. And they talk about the features of large language models and how fundamentally they are autoregressive in their search for the next token. Right? They're a token processing system within human cognition that could not arise naturally. Right? If you were not infected with representational cognition as a child, you would not develop it on your own. And this brings up another feature of humans that's very fascinating to me, which is that we are born entirely capable of adapting to any situation we might find ourselves in, other than situations where there's no oxygen and or no food, and or, you know, swarms of deadly microorganisms. Probably can't adapt well to any of those things. But I suspect, in fact I'm fairly certain, that our minds are not meant, they are not evolved for the purpose of becoming infected with representational cognition. I think they are born for the purpose of becoming trans-present in the network of intelligences that form the basis of time-space. Right? Time-space is not a thing, it's not a what, it's a they. And so, you know, at this very late date, for me, it's interesting to hear Hiemholz and Hahn reflect upon matters that I've been aware of, studying, and trying to understand probably for at least, even before I became aware of thrisps, probably for 40 years. Now, the awareness of thrisps grants some degree of immunity to them, if the awareness is maintained in an active way, rather than a passive way. And humans have the capacity to resist thrisp infection even after becoming representationally cognitive infectees. And one of the things that I heard in the discussion that fascinated me, and I think there's something to it, was that this feature of that which exists, or that which is a formal part of nature, and it's probably, I mean, this becomes philosophically dodgy here, but as far as I can tell, thrisps are the origin of evil. If we take the idea of evil seriously. But what they were talking about is a substrate agnostic feature of that which is. It's hard to find a word for this, that which is stuff, right? You can't say reality because that's not right. You can't say existence because that's not right. One might say this is an underlying feature of the organizational faculties implicit in origin and existence and reality. But what they were discussing was this kind of substrate agnostic process. And this I found very interesting, the substrate agnosticity. Because you can get the same kind of thing out of an LLM. You don't have to have an organism. Both of them don't believe that LLMs have any possibility of being conscious. Now, of course, the humans are famous for changing the meanings of key terms. This is part of our Thrisp infection, like consciousness or intelligence, so that anything that we like can qualify, right? Machines, computation, mathematics itself, Legos, right? Legos are intelligent. You fit them together and they make these structures and blah, 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 blah. I think that's a dangerous side effect of Thrisp infection, that we reify processes in origin, nature, becoming, and being as fundamentally mechanical when there's no chance that that's true. The opposite must be true. On a living planet with no humans, there are precisely zero machines. Or with no representational cognitives, I should say. So I found their discussion fascinating. A few things were new to me. The idea of a substrate agnostic process that just goes around infecting anything complex enough for it to get a foothold on. And again, these are not beings, in my view, these are not beings, they're not minds, they're not alive. They're something like dead structure that replicates itself using living structures, using living beings, right? Sort of like the model in the Matrix. And the model in the Matrix was not the first time someone had suggested this. Probably been similarly suggested in hundreds of science fiction novels and short stories and so forth. Most of us, however fascinated we may have been with language as children, detected a threat. I know I did. I could see my parents' depart relationship into structured declarations about identity, behavior, value, and so forth. And I knew something is wrong here. This is bad. This is wildly undesirable. It was obvious that my parents had been captured by something, even though I could not even begin to articulate this as a child. What I did do was swear to my heart that I would find a way to understand this and speak to it as an adult. I would not squander this awareness. And while I haven't succeeded as brilliantly as I might have hoped, I have and continue to make headway in that direction in this late phase of my life. This is fundamentally important to me because in my view, there's no more significant threat to life on Earth or human liberty or human intelligence or the fulfillment of the promise of our human birth, our human incarnation. and the fulfillment of the promise of existence for all living beings on this world and other worlds. If the humans were to escape Earth, this would be absolutely catastrophic. It must not happen. At least not at this phase in our de-evolution, our thrisp-driven collapse into insanity. Tokenization, replacing living beings with dead, repetitive, structured processes. Dead inside. Now, the thrisps form a network within the human cognition, a network feature, and they are more competitive and successful than any other feature of that network by far, like by exponentially more successful. And they're not merely exponentially more successful, they're exponentially more successful each moment that our species continues to exist in this state, or in this conundrum. The substrate agnosticity is really interesting because it implies that this is sort of a feature of the universe, right? It's the chaos against which life strives. How ironic that that structured, sort of algorithmic death machine can infect and propagate inside the human cognition. Now, without representational cognition, its foothold would be minimal. It would be non-zero. There'd be some presence of it. But representational cognition particularly is what makes us vulnerable. And this is the capacity to form tokens that refer to things and cause us to forget those things. Once we have the token, we lose the relationship. This terrifying danger is something we all have visceral experience of. Once I learn what a sparrow is, quote unquote, the is of identity is the fingerprint of Thrisps. I forget the relationship, its nature, the fact that those beings, those people, the sparrow people, are also me, my people. Their mind and my mind are one mind first, for the same urgent imperatives that all organisms bring into their existence. Those imperatives are not representational. They are organic, bio-relational, intelligent. So I'm going to take a break here and meditate. And I hope to return shortly with some fresh insight. But for the moment, Curt Jaimungal is a god. That man is doing something so brilliant, and I would claim holy, and absolutely intelligent and amazing, by bringing together all these minds under one flag of learning, understanding, something that actually resembles developmental progress. Such a brilliant human being. I cannot sing his praises profoundly enough. I shall return. Those of you who are familiar with my oeuvre, my 400 recordings and I don't know, 1,000 pages of text, not to mention 40,000 Facebook posts.
I think it doesn't hurt my legs, it hurts my shoulders now.
Probably know that I regularly speak about general semantics, otherwise known as non-Aristotelian logic, or Null-A, and the work of Alfred Korzybski. Korzybski was clearly aware of this problem, and perhaps somewhat naively, though he wasn't generally a naive person, he was also a madman. Many geniuses are partly mad. Korzybski was deeply aware of this problem and believed that he could solve it. He hoped to awaken our entire species to this issue, and he had developed a specific set of practices and applied intelligences that were oriented around an object he designed called the structural differential, which illustrates the problem we face with abstraction and tokenization, and particularly the problem that orbits the single word is. Specifically when this word is used to declare identity, what something is. Ian McGilchrist is also aware of this problem, though he approaches it from the angle of neuroscience, and specifically the topic of hemispheric lateralization, which could clumsily be described as how different aspects of consciousness, cognition, emotion, sensing, memory, engagement, attention, and so forth are curated by different features of the brain, but particularly the relatively modern understandings of the different ways of being in the world associated with the cerebral hemispheres, although he does not limit his concerns just to the cerebral hemispheres. And in his view, stated again very clumsily, the right hemisphere, left side of the body, by the way, the side that has a heart, is all about relation and playing with ambiguity, which is obvious in dreaming, where explicit identity is the equivalent of death. If you're dreaming and somebody asks you for your papers or your passport or your driver's license, you're about to wake up, which means the end of the dreaming mind's free play in awareness and relation, which are what truly matters to it. Conversely, the left cerebral hemisphere, right side of the body, is not surprisingly very concerned with grasping, tokenization, mechanisms, function, utility, profit, and is also quite concerned with blaming. The right hemisphere is not particularly concerned with blaming, otherwise known as egregious analytical relational dissociation. Doesn't much care about that. We might notice the playful, what's the right word? Can't find this word I want. We might playfully notice that to blame is literally to be lame. Lame how? Well, without legs relationally. Though I myself have judgments about relational integrity and exchanges, not merely those of others, like my evil aunt who twice stole my grandmother's estate, and who to this day I'm quite angry with about that. I think my grandmother would probably also be very angry. But also myself, for there are many memorial instances where I defected somehow from relationship, rarely intentionally, though if I look back on my behavior, it looks like I was intentional about that. And so I have, shame and regret and chagrin and these kinds of feelings when I look back on failing people that I cared for or who cared for me, sometimes somewhat egregiously. Hopefully less of that now and in the future. So Korzybski had placed his crosshairs on this is of identity, and the structural differential is a training device that, through working with it physically with your hands, illustrates the problem very clearly, comprised of layers of excerption, right? We take specific qualities, tokens, expectations, and so forth, and we substitute those for what's actually going on in our experience and the possibility space of awareness and intelligence. And then we just treat the entire situation as if the strange little excerptions we've made that have registers, right? There's what he thinks of as an animal register. These are qualities any animal might ascertain about phenomena. And then the representational cognitive register. And so what is immediately apparent is that phenomena have infinite qualities, and those that we excerpt do not tell us really about the phenomena, though they can inform us to some degree, depending on our purposes and the mode of our purposive awareness or concern. The problem isn't necessarily representational cognition, it's the misuse of it, such that tokens come to rule over the possibility space of intelligence, awareness, learning, relationship, and so forth, thus collapsing it to sclerotic, structured fictions, which evict relation and really like little tokens they can manipulate, right? The gripping hand, the grasping hand. Turns out that left-handed people are different. What a surprise. Because they lateralize differently. Also, people with injuries on either side of the brain have unique features that arise therefrom. Damage to the visual cortex, particularly. The left eye can produce unusual versions of the problems implicit in situations where the left hemisphere is dominant in awareness, right? It's going to have a predilection for structure and have grave difficulty with relationships. So Korzybski was quite aware of this and wrote his book Science and Sanity about this problem. And he introduces an entire sort of way of thinking about these matters that is profoundly technical. Yeah? And often somewhat inscrutable at first glance. I first encountered this book at 17 after being introduced to it by A.E. Van Vo, the author of the Null-A science fiction books, Slan, a book on hypnosis, which he co-authored, and some other stories. And when I first encountered Science Insanity, it was inscrutable to me. I think I was 16 or 17. I read the whole thing nonetheless. I just couldn't understand it. During my non-ordinary experience in 2002, this book was highlighted by the intelligence that was teaching me as an excellent example of a human who understood features of the underlying problems that we face in these matters. Now I want to be very clear about something. So to do so, let me make an analogy. Suppose you have someone in your life who has done something or not done something that transforms their identity for you into, quote, the enemy, unquote. So in my own life, this would be like my evil aunt, Debbie. Now, once you've undergone this transformation, the token enemy stands over the relational environment, predetermining and post-determining its derivation, right? So this doesn't harm my Aunt Debbie in any way, really, though it may deprive her of certain relational opportunities with me, presuming she valued any of them. What it does is fuck me up, right? Because now I have a sort of a gravestone in my mind where this relationship was once vital and dynamic. And whenever I think of this person, I just am angry. Now, that's not the only thing that happens, but that's what's inclined to happen. Now, indigenous peoples, when we use this phrase, speaking of a topology, right? There's all different kinds of varieties of indigenous minds and thought, times and places where these people lived or live. And so the phrase is kind of meaningless, and this is important to notice. It gives a hint about what, quote unquote, I'm referring to or who I'm referring to. But it's a very vague hint, and it's a generalization over a topology, and what I actually want to point out isn't the topology of indigenous minds. It's the topology inherent to certain indigenous cultures, times, and places wherein these people were deeply aware of the danger of reifying tokens. Often their word for enemy has nothing like the connotation set we have. And there was also a shared imperative in these specific indigenous peoples to not become trapped by what we say or even derivations of identity, because their inclination was to grant the possibility space primacy rather than the derivation, unlike we moderns, and particularly those of us in countries like the United States, which are about as disunited as states could possibly be. So upon seeing, there are actually complex stories about this, particularly in Blackfoot, There's a story about two enemies, quote unquote, who are both going to lead their people. They want to lead their people to a successful combat encounter, but they're sort of derided by their people, not seen as intelligent or powerful. And so on both sides of the conflict, one of the young men leaves the village with the intention to go on a suicide mission, if I remember correctly, and kill up a bunch of the enemy and die in that process, and thus become heroic and all of this thing. I'm probably misstating many of these things badly, but this is the general thread of the thing. And they meet unexpectedly. There's a terrible storm. It's very dark. Neither of them can see anything. And they both end up in this deep inside a cave where it's pitch black. There's no light whatsoever. And they meet. And they use touch language. And eventually, it's very complex, the exchange. Eventually they both realize, oh, this is a snake man, this is the enemy of the snake people, and so forth. But instead of fighting and killing each other, they decide to engage in a play of fiction. And they both go back to their people and say something that resembles, I've killed up some of the enemy, here's one of their scalps. They give each other pieces of hair, and come with me and I'll take you to where the dead people that I killed are, enemies I killed are. So they both go back to their tribes and they bring their people together. And then they exchange families. The one young man gives his family to the other young man and vice versa. And they dwell together in great joy and prosperity for a time until the summer ends, until the time of plentiful food ends, and they are preparing to return to their traditional living places. What takes place at that point is that during a competitive game, the children and the teenagers are most excited by all of this. They think this is fabulous. But they're engaging in a game, and during the game, a child of one of the tribes, a young man, is presumably accidentally killed. And the cycle of enmity begins again. But notice that they had the capacity to understand that the derivation doesn't tell you the identity. The possibility space is open, fundamentally. And you can see features of this problem, particularly modernly in the United States, where identity politics was apparently born. You can see features of this problem here, where some people are wanting to escape from the seeming trap of, for example, traditional gender roles or traditional identity roles, or the identity and roles that are on offer, right, on retail on offer. You can buy them off the shelf. You don't have to we do have to pay for them, but it's very complicated, that matter. So one of the things that's obvious here, first of all, is that tokens can capture peoples. And when, in part, identity politics and political correctness are reactions, not particularly intelligent reactions, generally, but again, it's a topology, to the explicit declaration of identities, right? What would be much wiser, I think, and more effective, as well as more playful, would be simply if we recognized that explicit derivations of identity are toxic, fundamentally. Doesn't mean they're only toxic, but when they're explicit, the use of the word is it turns out to be the problem here. It's not untrue that I am a man. This am word is the individual, subjective, right? Indexical for is. So I am a man, but what fraction of my nature, being, origin, possibility, potential does that grant me or encompass? Very little. Not none. So it's really, the problem fundamentally is with explicit derivations of identity.
No, but yeah, it is. That's right. You've been active and proactive.
Even such words as you, me, I, they, these are identifiers. But there are presumptions and connotations to each of these that invisibly dominate our consideration, awareness, attention, interaction, relationship, and so forth. We'd be much better playing in the space around those with a sense of curiosity and wonder, awe, reverence, love, communion, exploration, dreaming, intelligence, like the real stuff. Yeah. And the problem for us moderns is that explicit statements about identity or function trap us in a model that cannot be true. We mistake the provisionality of the truthfulness of statements about identity for all there is. Naturally, in cognition, this is the repercussion. And these are problems really with our education, right? Or the process of enlanguaging and enculturation leaves out the antidotes to the diseases it naturally introduces, unsurprisingly, since most of the process is run by thrisps, not humans. So when you see a human, what you're seeing is a human animal. There I use that is thing.
Well, in the beginning.
But first it is the face of origin itself, then it is a being, then perhaps it is an organism, then an animal, then a human animal, then a representational cognitive, and then, you know, a man or a woman or a non-genderizing person, or a multi-genderizing person, or whatever, which in truth we all are, because every moment of behavior is a topology of gender features that we could associate with gender or its indeterminacy. So what you are seeing, though, when you see a human, primarily you are seeing an animal that is captured by thrisps. Don't believe me? Look at the person's bank records. Look at, catalog their possessions, which possess them. Understand their relationship with vocation and work, with religion and politics and ideas, right? And so is there actually a person there? Like, the problems of gender identity and political correctness are both thrisps, right? Now, thrisps aren't inherently bad. For example, the thrisp, which is the concept of thrisps, has the capacity to liberate humans from this capture. when it's understood and enacted in individuals and communal groups of humans. But nothing gets humans acting as in such an organized way, and often an incredibly lethal way, as deleterious thrisps. The recent debacle where a young man took the life of the CEO of a health insurance company is an example of someone responding as a human being to the lethal, unjustifiable, egregious nonsense, harm, murder that corporations naturally engage in, acting as if they were persons without any culpability, yeah? Or with such negligible culpability that it basically doesn't exist. Well, I am returning now to the very thrispy environs outside Golden Gate Park, filled with boxes and machines and objects and shops and restaurants and things. And it's going to become pretty noisy, so I should probably wind up now. I just want to sing once more Curt's praises. What a brilliant human being. What an incredible example of enacting the possibilities of his curiosity and intelligence and passion for learning, awareness, understanding, and attacking the thrisp networks that have for so long dominated the humans in his own very unique, prodigious, and playful way. Yeah, I love his advertisement for The Economist is pretty hilarious. They're supporting his channel. And he says something like, hey, I see you inching away. Don't be like the economy. And then he goes on to sing the praises of The Economist, which is also a thrisp network, but, you know, some networks give better value than others and have less downside than others. Some thrisp networks. So I hope that you found this enlightening and learned with me something. You know, in my own explorations, which one of my dear friends recently called absolutely tedious and boring, I take it that he was unable to find even the slightest jewel or nourishment. But part of what's going on is that I am trying to remember and understand my own, I'm recapitulating my own path in learning and discovery, orientation and insight, and reminding myself of these things. But also imagining you out there listening, curious, passionate, filled with dreams and spirit and soulfulness and love. And I'm profoundly grateful for this moment together and just to still be alive after the strange and often estranging experiences that I've had. So thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful to those of you who pay attention and listen. I hope that you've experienced some insight and have questions and insights of your own. And if you do, please share them. I will respond to them. Take a moment, if you will, and tickle the algorithm or support my work. You can join the 4 people who presently support my work. Okay? It's a very small crew. Or feel free to leave a scathing criticism which I also enjoy and learn from. I wish you beautiful dreams, healing, insight, liberation, and the fulfillment of the profoundly beautiful possibilities of your human incarnation. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.